fellow minders. Welcome back to another Mind Shot vlog. And these images are coming to you from Colonial Williamsburg in Virginia. We just recently got back from there, and man, did we have fun. We've been planning this trip actually for several years, and just for one reason or another, not been able to go. The history, we love history. It was fantastic, and their interpreters and educators were top-notch, some of the best we've ever seen, and we go to a lot of historical sites. One of the things I love about this place is they have attended to every detail. I mean, every backyard, every alleyway, every corner of every room that you look in is just, they've attended to every detail. Fully restored, or in every case that they could, have used actual period antiques. All these vases here, actual from the time. All the artisans are fully skilled in their trade and use all the original tools, like this cabinet maker. Really impressed with that. And they are a working artisans. They're actually working on pieces that are to be used. Again, everywhere you turn. I had lots of great pictures too, so hopefully we'll do some sketches. Experience was just great. Took a ride in this carriage, and that was a real thrill. Just heading down the back streets and feeling like it might have been back in the day. I think I might have even found a distant relative of Reese. He's going to be excited to hear about that. And for those who know me and my wife well, they might think that we finally found our place in the world. No comment. So I wanted to do a portrait of this fellow, who obligingly let me photograph him outside one of the shops. I spent some time on this drawing. Now, what's unusual about this is that if this had been like what I would call a finished painting, I mean, it is a finished painting, but it's in a sketchbook. It's in my perfect sketchbook, watercolor sketchbook. But if I had done a finished painting, like one on loose sheet paper that you would frame, I would have worked this sketch out carefully on paper first. I would have carefully edited the proportions and whatnot. When you work in a sketchbook, you kind of tend to go a little more preciously and gingerly, and or loosely and roughly. But I don't. My point is, I don't do a lot of working out the sketch, re-erasing, redoing, all that stuff. So when little errors creep in, you know, kind of let them stay. And this is hard to tell from this angle. The head was too small for the body. I had several issues with that. I'll talk about that at the end. It becomes a little more evident when you put on paint. And these errors creep in. It's one of the things I wanted to talk to you about is drawing, and why drawing is so important. You know, again, I was very gingerly and lightly drawing here because I didn't want to have, I knew a few erasures would be necessary. I didn't want to abrade the paper too much, so I just really needed to work on this drawing a little more. I'm not terribly unhappy with it. I think it worked out fine. Well, anyway, I'm rambling. The point is, drawing, it just got me thinking about drawing and how important drawing is. I've made this statement many times in videos, and it's just so important. Now, I think one of the things I've said many times, and I think it's really misunderstood, and I need to correct the statement because the way I say it can be taken wrong. I've often said, if you can't draw, you can't paint. And that's really a erroneous way to say it. What I mean by that is not you shouldn't paint until you can draw. I definitely don't mean that. And I don't mean that you'll never be able to paint unless you can draw. The more correct way to say it, the way I should say it, is if you will not draw, you will not improve with your painting. I feel that strongly about it. It is that linked. And a lot of people don't understand that. They don't believe it until they do it. There's just, you know, that integral relationship between drawing and painting. And drawing, let me be clear, is an act. It's not a medium. You can draw with anything. You can draw with paint. But when you're painting, you're covering areas. When you're drawing, you're more linear and you're more concerned with form. So the natural and easy way to draw is usually with a pencil or some kind of similar implement, pencil, charcoal, something like that. Pencil's used because it can be erased. You're focusing on values, contour, contrast, proportion, as I was talking about in this case, proportion. Now, I've done direct watercolor, and believe me, direct watercolor where you don't draw is hard, but in reality, you are drawing. You're drawing with the paint. So there's no way, if you are producing the images that you're painting from scratch, in other words, you're not tracing them or coloring in a book. You're producing them, and this is what you want to do. You want to be a faithful renderer in a realistic and representational way. You've got to be able to draw, and the best way to improve is to draw frequently and often. So I was just reminded of that as I was doing this piece, because normally I don't get this refined when I'm working on sketchbook paintings. So I should have spent more time working out the sketch and drawing. And I know some of you are going to focus on this and say, oh, well, it looks pretty good to me. Well, that's not the point. I've done this long enough that I understand, what something could be. I analyze things for myself to improve. It's just the point I'm making is drawing cannot be unlinked from a representational art if that's something you want to do and get better and better and better at. You've got to draw, and you've got to do it a lot. And it's not a matter of saying, oh, well, I'm not any good at drawing. It's not a static thing. It doesn't matter if you're any good at it. You can get better. And how much you draw will determine how much you improve. Now, I fully support tracing photos for beginners, tracing difficult subjects if you just want to get to painting. But let me reiterate and stress, tracing is actually a form of drawing practice. Some people say, why can you learn anything from tracing? Actually, you can. One of the illustrators I knew in my career, and I considered him a mentor, just said a shocking thing to me. He said, I've learned as much through tracing as I have through drawing. What it does is it allows you to see contours when you're tracing something, like tracing paper on a light table. See and study how to convert something that's virtually grayscale into actual contours. So trace away is practice. I mean, we talk about tracing and how that's bad and how that's cheating. Well, we're talking about original art that an artist might display or sell or put in a gallery. Practice, anything that helps you develop is fair game. So I don't want to drone on and on. I think I've made my point. Get out those sketchbooks. Have a sketchbook where you do slightly more finished drawings. Have doodle books where it can be the kind of book where you do not let anybody see it at all. You just doodle something. Be very comfortable. Learn to be very comfortable with a pen. It could be a pen or a pencil or a marker. If you want to draw with a brush and paint, go for it. So as I was mentioning earlier, I got the proportions off a little bit on this. It's more evident once you see the whole thing painted. The head ended up being too small for the body. When I went back and checked measurements, it verified it. So because this was too far along to make revisions, major revisions like, enlarging the head and all, we call it cheating the results or selling the effect. In other words, you may not really be changing the proportions, but you're doing things to help the eye sell the proportions that you have. I mean, obviously it can't work if proportions are way off, but if you have some proportions that are slightly off, then you can maybe alter some things a little bit. You can kind of help things appear as though they're more correct, even though they may not be. We'll get to the end, I'll tell you what I did. And a lot of the painting and shading, I'm going in layers. I think probably that's obvious from the clips that you've seen. And then I go back, you know, and I deepen shadows. I'm not doing a lot of graded shading, you know, where I blend everything out smoothly. I decided to go with a more dab approach, which is something I like to do when I want the painting to look more structural and textural. So a lot of times it's great to add paint in flat washes where you don't blend it a lot. You know, you layer it. When I get to the sleeves in the arms, you'll see more of that. But I'm doing that with the trousers here to give them a real textural look. And this is pretty much going in value layers. This is more or less the second layer. Everything that I'm doing is value related. It's not detail related. And I know that may seem strange for me to say, and you look at this, you say, well, it looks to me like you're adding all these detail, these folds. Well, only so much as those things need to portray value, and I can use some of the details to create texture, and bundled together they can be value. So a wrinkle, a fold, I want it to be there. I want the impression of it maybe, but I also want to bring the value down in those areas. When you layer with watercolor, if you're painting transparently, that's what you're doing. You're gradually taking the value down, 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 and towards the end you'll see it gets down to just tiny dabs in places where I'm just bringing out points of contrast and lowlights. So yeah, I'm painting in details, but I am more concerned with the values in those areas. And the detail only serves to hint and suggest what's there. And I could go into some very meticulous blending in some of these folds, but I think a better way is just to start out with flat washes, just render in those wrinkles and those folds and straight up flat washes. Then you just go back with successive flat washes, slightly darker, in the darker recesses of them. It's a very effective technique, makes it look very much like cloth. And you don't need to do all this meticulous blending. Here I'm adding a few darker streaks, for instance, in those folds. Started out wanting this to have some lost and found edges. If you look on the left side and the right side of the sleeves, I wanted to lose those edges, so he just sort of blended into the background. That's also why I brought the orange of the vest, the midtones, into the background as well. But as I went along, I found I needed to make some revisions to sell those proportions a little more, so I ended up painting around the sleeves and bringing it in so the body mass didn't look so big, match the proportions of the head. You know, doing figure drawing and portrait drawing is a great way to practice proportion because they matter the most in portraits, probably over anything. Here you can see I'm adding in some of those lower values over the lighter folds and fabric color. I mean, this just shows you don't have to do a lot of smooth, intricate blending. Value's what's important. And when I add those darker values, I'm not filling in that lighter shade that I added before. I'm just adding it in the darker section, so your eye ends up sort of blending it. You know, when you have shadows that go under things like shirt collars or behind things, and you get these dark little recesses, one thing you want to make sure about is watch your edges. Don't create a line. Don't create an outline if you can help it. Pull your value away from the edge, perpendicular to the edge. Dab, you know, short stroke. One of the problems is people see a shadow in contrast, like say these pants next to the arm, and they'll just draw a dark outline around it. Problem is it's not following the contour of what's behind the highlighted or foreground object. So, you know, the best way to make something look like it goes behind something and give contrast is to kind of stroke in a perpendicular, or, you know, just dab in places. And here you're just going to see me continuing more of the same, adding a few little pops here and there, and they're going to get smaller and smaller as we go into those dark recesses. I didn't have any strong light here really. This was very ambient, diffused light. It was an overcast part of the day. So I made the best of it. Again, it's tempting to take a bench like that and graduate it very smoothly away from his leg, but I wanted to keep in that textural approach and just dab. Now we're going to work on the face, and I want to start by getting in some of the dark linear aspects, like the lines. But in reality, it's no different than the rest of it. It's just I'm getting those so I don't lose them when I add middle tones and start deepening the shadows. But I'm going to do the same thing basically. Keep going darker and darker into the shadowed areas. You have to be careful with faces because it's easy to overshade faces. I see overshaded faces all the time. Shading on faces is usually very subtle, especially when you have filtered light like we were in. And this was probably the only place in the painting where I did do a good bit of smooth blending. So I didn't want there to be too much distraction in the texture of the face. And sometimes that can look wonky. So I did smooth and blend the washes fairly well here. You know, what I was talking about earlier, the proportion problem, it happens to all of us. I mean, you know, there are some really good artists out there who get proportion right almost every time, and it seems like they never have to work it out. I'm not one of those artists. I make proportion mistakes all the time. And I think one of the most aggravating things for me is to get this far along, which I was nearly the end, and say, oh, rats, that proportion is just off. It's wrong. And I've had some of you comment to me that you do that. How do you keep from, going far down the road on a painting or on a drawing and then realizing that it's off? You didn't see it before. It happens. It just does. I can't tell you how many times this happened to me. So take heart. You get a stale eye when you work on these things, and kind of myopic. Your eye can focus in on one area, not really concentrate on how they relate. And that's all proportion is. It's one part, one size, one alignment of something as it relates to something else, an angle of something as it relates to something else. Getting the sizes, the proportions to make sense, to not look distorted. These hands, oh man, I redrew the hands 4 times. And again, doing this in a sketchbook was the problem. I went right down to start drawing in my sketchbook, and because I was doing this in a fairly finished state, I didn't work out the sketch ahead of time. And that's how you avoid those problems, is you use preliminary sketches like scratch paper. And had this been a finished painting on loose sheet, something I might have framed or sold, I would have done that. I would have worked out those hands. And you can, without even redrawing, sometimes you can take and scan a piece in and manipulate it digitally. I did that a lot when I was an illustrator, because time is a factor. So I might have scanned this piece in, for instance, taken and enlarged the head, maybe moved it down a tad, and gotten the proportion right in a sketch before I did the final rendering. Here I'm just adding some highlights with gouache to the glasses and finishing off those buttons. But you can see there the proportion of that head is a little small for the body. Some of it is a visual effect. And here was the fix. I actually fattened up the face a little bit, gave him a stronger jaw. I wasn't going for a likeness. And I brought the backgrounds in around on the sleeve to slim him down a little bit, and that sold the proportions a little better. They weren't real far off, but it helped me like it a little better. It'll work. I mean, for a sketchbook painting, it'll work. Thanks, everybody. Appreciate you tuning in. Thanks, patrons, for supporting this channel, and we will see everybody in the next video.